In this presentation, we will look at the history and the life of Viktor Frankl and try to understand the story behind how he came up with the theory that we are going to study. In September of 1942, a young doctor, his new bride, his mother, father, and brother were arrested in Vienna and taken to a concentration camp in Bohemia. It was events that occurred there and 3 other camps that led the young doctor prisoner 119-104 to realize the significance of meaningfulness in life. One of the earliest events to drive home the point was the loss of a manuscript, his life's work. During his transfer to Auschwitz, he had sewn it into the lining of his coat, but was forced to discard it at the last minute. He spent many later nights trying to reconstruct it, first in his mind, then on slips of stolen paper. Another significant moment came while on a pre-dawn march to work on laying railroad tracks. Another prisoner wondered out aloud about the fate of their wives. The young doctor began to think about his own life and realized that she was present within him. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. And throughout his ordeal, he could not help but see that among those given a chance for survival, it was those who held on to a vision of the future, whether it be a significant task before them or a return to their loved ones, that were most likely to survive their suffering. It would be, in fact, the meaningfulness that could be found in suffering itself that would most impress him. There is also purpose in that life which is almost barren of both creation and enjoyment, and which admits of but one possibility of high moral behavior, namely in man's attitude to his existence, an existence restricted by external forces. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. This is just a brief introduction to Viktor Frankl and where his ideas for his theory came about. Let's look at the biography. He was born in Vienna on March 26, 1905. In high school, he was very active, graduated in 1925, and he met Freud. And he also managed to read up on essays written on Freud about psychoanalysis. In 1928 to 1929, Frankl organized cost-free counseling centers for teenagers in Vienna and 6 other cities, and began working at the Psychiatric University Clinic. In 1930, he received his doctorate in medicine and was promoted to an assistant. In 1937, Frankl opened his new practice in neurology and psychiatry. In 1940, Frankl was made head of the neurological department. During this period that he began his manuscript, The Doctor and the Soul. In September of 1942, like we heard in the introduction, his brother, father, mother, and wife was sent to a concentration camp in Bohemia. It was events that occurred there and at 3 other camps that led Frankl to realize the significance of meaningfulness in life. Father died of starvation. Mother and brother were killed in Auschwitz in 1944. His wife died in 1945. His manuscript, or his life work, The Doctor and the Soul, was discovered and destroyed. April of 1945, Frankl's camp was liberated and he returned to Vienna. He received the position of director of the Vienna Neurological Polyclinic again. He married again in 1947. In 1948, Frankl received his PhD in philosophy. In 1950, he founded and became president of the Austrian Medical Society for Psychotherapy. In 1997, he published his final work, Man's Search for Meaning, out of which he came up with his theory, logotherapy. In 1997, he died on September 2nd. A bit regarding his theory. His objective was to avoid all forms of reductionism in relation to human beings, and he knew this existed because he had encountered Freud's work. His initial criticism took Freudian psychoanalysis and Adler's individual psychology to task and described them as reductionist theories, while psychoanalysis tried to understand human behavior on the basis of a utilitarian pleasure homeostatic principle. Individual psychology understood human behavior as an expression of the will to power. And in Frankl's idea, he said that human behavior can and should not be reduced to psychological or biological mechanisms, as was done through Freud's unconscious. Rather, human beings are mainly characterized by being spiritual. As spiritual beings, they are not determined but are able to act freely and responsibly and to realize value and meaning. If you have seen the introductory video to existentialism, right now you can identify that Frankl conveys or echoes the core principles of existentialism, basically the idea of spirituality, and that human beings are not deterministic, but that they are responsible and free to choose their own fate and identify the meaning of life. And this is why Frankl falls under the umbrella of existentialism.
Moving on, I will now talk about the philosophical aspects in relation to Viktor Frankl's personality theory. Frankl's theory of personality is based on three basic premises or assumptions, and as you can see on your screen, the three of them are 1. Freedom of will, 2. Will to meaning, and 3. Meaning of life. Let us now move ahead and look at what exactly he implied by the use of these three assumptions or premises. When speaking of the freedom of will, Frankl recognized that human beings are subject to a wide variety of limiting conditions and influences, which are biological, psychological, and sociocultural. However, he did not believe that these limiting conditions and influences totally determine an individual's response to his or her life situation. No matter what these conditions are, an individual can take a stand against them. This he referred to as resistance. He cited his own experience in Nazi concentration camps as evidence of man's capacity to rise above the most adverse circumstances. According to Frankl, as human beings, we have the capacity to resist not only external circumstances but also our own physical and psychological drives. In doing so, we essentially open up a new dimension of existence, namely the dimension of meaning. One enters this dimension whenever one is reflecting upon oneself. It is important to note that when speaking of the dimension of meaning, Frankl's theory laid specific emphasis on this dimension. The search for meaning or the quest for meaning is something that he stressed on when he spoke of his personality theory, and this will be touched on more in the coming slides. The second premise, as laid out by Frankl, is the will to meaning. Frankl maintained that a human being's most basic and primary motivation is not self-actualization as was laid out by Maslow, but it was finding as much meaning in existence as possible and realizing as much value in life as possible. The striving for self-actualization emphasized by humanistic psychologists was regarded by Frankl as a lower level of human functioning. In his view, it could not possibly be the ultimate purpose or the final goal of life. As is true of other subjective conditions such as pleasure or happiness, self-fulfillment cannot be attained by directly searching for it or pursuing it. As one strives to discover meaning and value in one's life, one may also find fulfillment as a byproduct. Frankl spoke of the will to meaning as an authentic and genuine human phenomenon and not as a neurotic symptom of unconscious conflicts. Rather than dismissing the will to meaning as a mere neurotic phenomenon, Frankl used it as an important psychotherapeutic principle. In his view, the will to meaning can not only preserve mental and physical health, but may also help an individual to survive extreme conditions of pain, suffering, and grief. This will to meaning helped Frankl and others survive the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps. The final of the three premises laid out by Frankl is the meaning of life. The meaning of life varies from person to person and from situation to situation. In that sense, meaning is relative, although Frankl preferred to use the term unique to describe this variation in meanings. Meanings are unique, as are the situations encountered. The meaning of a whole life is unique insofar as life is a series of unique situations. Because all meanings are unique, there cannot be any universal meaning of life. However, there are situations that have something in common and therefore give rise to common meanings. For this reason, meanings are shared by people living in a given society or even across cultures and in different historical times. For example, the meaning of the virtue of loyalty has remained common through all generations of collectivistic cultures. Thus, the virtue of loyalty can be seen as a shared or common meaning that are shared by a particular society or a group of people. These shared meanings Frankl referred to as values. In speaking of values, Frankl has said that they aid one's search for meaning, but they also have a tendency to complicate it. In the typical situations of life, our values furnish different meanings in our life. One is not confronted with the need to make a decision as to life's meaning. On the other hand, a conflict between two values may ultimately produce a neurogenic neurosis. What is a neurogenic neurosis? Neurogenic neurosis is a term used in logotherapy which denotes a form of neurosis stemming from existential frustration, which is a similar concept to an existential crisis. This form of neurosis will be spoken of in later parts of this tutorial video. The next concept spoken of by Viktor Frankl was that about the quest for meaning in one's life. For this, Frankl recognized three chief groups of values pertaining to what we have talked about earlier, and these three chief groups of values he discussed as three broad approaches towards finding meaning in one's life. The first approach that he identified is that of experiential values. Experiential values are those that we gain by experiencing something or someone whom we value. This can include Maslow's peak experiences, which he spoke of, and aesthetic experiences such as viewing great art or natural wonders. The most important example of experiential values, as given by Frankl, is the love that we feel towards another. Through our love, we can enable our beloved to develop meaning, and by doing so, we develop meaning ourselves. Love, he says, is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Frankl points out that in modern society, many confuse sex with love. Without love, he says, sex is nothing more than masturbation, and the other is nothing more than a tool to be used, a means to an end. Sex can only be fully enjoyed as the physical expression of love. Love, he says, is the recognition of the uniqueness of the other as an individual with an intuitive understanding of their full potential as a human being. Frankl believes this is only possible within monogamous relationships. As long as partners are interchangeable, they mainly remain as objects. The second means of discovering meaning is through creative values, or by doing a deed, as put by Franklin. This is the traditional existential idea of providing oneself with meaning by becoming involved in one's projects, or better, in the project of one's own life. It includes the creativity involved in art, music, writing, invention, and so on. Frankl views creativity, as well as love, as a function of the spiritual unconscious, which is nothing but one's own conscience. The irrationality of artistic production is the same as the intuition that allows us to recognize the good. By this, he implies that our intuition is the very same as the irrationality of the artistic production of our creativity, and he says that these both act as means for us to recognize the common good in our lives. The third and final way of finding meaning in one's life, as proposed by Frankl, is through the use of attitudinal values. Attitudinal values help a human being face a fate that he cannot change. Attitudinal values include such virtues such as compassion, bravery, a good sense of humor, and so on. But Frankl's most famous example of an attitudinal value is achieving meaning by way of suffering. Frankl's view of human nature. Frankl regarded the nature of human beings as three-dimensional. In addition to the physical and psychological dimensions, there is a spiritual dimension to human life. Frankl considered the spiritual dimension uniquely human because other creatures do not seem to have anything comparable to it. Most of the time, human beings live on the physical or the psychological plane, but we have the capacity to transcend or rise above these planes. It is only when we rise above our physical and psychological nature that we enter the spiritual dimension. Frankl is of the viewpoint that humans are mostly governed by the experiential, creative, and attitudinal values, but these are just surface manifestations of supra-meaning or transcendence. Frankl says that supra-meaning or transcendence is the idea that there is, in fact, ultimate meaning in life, meaning that is not dependent on others, on our projects, or even on our dignity. It is a reference to God and spiritual meaning. Considered the spiritual dimension uniquely human because other creatures do not seem to have anything comparable to it. Most of the time, human beings live on the physical or the psychological plane, but we have the capacity to transcend or rise above these planes. It is only when we rise above our physical and psychological nature that we enter the spiritual dimension. It should be understood that Frankl's ideas about religion and spirituality are considerably broader than most. His God is not the God of the narrow mind, not the God of one denomination or another. It is not even the God of institutional religion. God, he says, is very much a God of the inner human being, a God of the heart. Even the atheist or the agnostic, he points out, may accept the idea of transcendence without making use of the word God. Frankl is of the viewpoint that we need to learn to endure our inability to fully comprehend ultimate meaningfulness, for logos or meaning is deeper than logic. Frankl's view, the principle of homeostasis, does not apply to psychic functioning. Human beings do not necessarily seek a state of equilibrium or homeostasis in which all our basic drives have been fulfilled and in which they are free of all tension. A healthy person is not perpetually concerned about his or her subjective condition. The person's interests are focused on the external world, and he or she experiences a certain healthy tension produced by an unfinished project, the completion of which will fulfill the meaning of that individual's life. A neurotic individual, by contrast, is concerned only with the subjective state. Such a condition may be corrected only by diverting the attention of the individual from the self to the outside world, and in this way to challenge the person to discover the meanings of one's life. Because human beings are finite creatures and psychophysical organisms, Frankl says that we are subject to the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. In the physical and psychological realms, we are confronted with many forces over which we have little control. For example, we must eat, sleep, procreate, grow old, and die. The conditions of social life under which most people live impose other kinds of limitation on us and bring to bear a whole host of other determining forces that shape and mold us. One's family, one's social class, one's peers, the schools attended, and other institutions of society such as government agencies and the mass media all determine one's beliefs, attitudes, and values as well as behavior. Despite all these diverse forces and influences that act on us and mold us in significant ways, it would be an error to believe that human behavior is totally determined by these forces. No matter what circumstances an individual is in, he or she can take a stand. This gives one freedom to decide what one wants to do in a given situation, such as refusing to buy a product despite a high-pressured sales pitch. In some situations, it is necessary to resist a natural inclination or established habits to realize some particular value in an activity, such as engaging in a creative project. Humans thus have the ability to rise not only above our external circumstances, but also above ourselves. In doing so, we shape our own destiny and ourselves as well. This freedom gives us the responsibility for what we do and for what we are. It is through repeatedly exercising this freedom of choice that the individual creates his or her own character. One of Viktor Frankl's major concepts is conscience. He sees conscience as a sort of unconscious spirituality, different from the instinctual unconscious that Freud and others emphasize. The conscience is not just one factor among many. It is the core of our being and the source of our personal integrity. He refers to the conscious as a pre-reflective ontological self-understanding, or in simpler terms, the wisdom of the heart. He says that it is the conscious that sniffs out that which gives our life. According to Frankl, conscience is intuitive and highly personalized. It refers to a real person in a real situation and cannot be reduced to simple universal laws. Instead, it must be lived. According to Frankl, most people attempt to find guidance in conformity and conventionality, but it becomes increasingly difficult to avoid facing the fact that we now have the freedom and the responsibility to make our own choices in life and to find our own meaning. Tradition and traditional values are quickly disappearing from many people's lives, but while that is difficult for us, it need not lead us into despair. Meaning is not to be tied to society's values. Instead, each society attempts to summarize meaningfulness in its codes of conduct, but ultimately meanings are unique to each individual. And thus, this is why, according to Frankl, our job as physicians, therapists and educators is to assist people in developing their individual consciences and finding and fulfilling.
Moving on to the criticisms. Frankl attempts to reinsert religion into psychology. By couching religion in the most tolerant and liberal language, he is asking us to base our understanding of human existence on faith, on a blind acceptance of the existence of ultimate truth, without evidence other than the feelings and intuitions and anecdotes of those who already believe. Critical views of the life of logotherapy's founder and his work assume that Frankl's religious background and experience of suffering guided his conception of meaning within the boundaries of the person, and therefore that logotherapy is founded on Viktor Frankl's worldview. We see Frankl's religious undertone in the idea of supra-meaning, which is the idea that there is, in fact, ultimate meaning in life, meaning that is not dependent on others, on our projects, or even on our dignity. It is a reference to God and spiritual meaning. Frankl, like me and others, refers to himself as an existentialist. Religion, even liberal religion, always posits essences at the root of human existence. Existentialism does not. Rollo May, an American existential psychologist, argued that logotherapy is, in essence, authoritarian. He suggested that Frankl's therapy presents a plain solution to all of life's problems, an assertion that would seem to undermine the complexity of human life itself. This is seen in Frankl's emphasis on the lack of meaning in life as a cause for most of his theories on existential vacuum and psychopathology. May contended that if a patient could not find his own meaning, Frankl would provide a goal for his patient. In effect, this would negate the patient's personal responsibility, thus diminishing the patient as a person.